So welcome everyone this morning. My name's Brendan Gleeson. I'm Director of the Melbourne Sustainable Society Institute, and I point that out because the Institute is a major supporter of the college where we are now. It's wonderful also for me to be here and also be in the role of Alexei Trundle's supervisor, co-supervising with Leslie Head, who should be on her way, we hope. Move this way, right? Anyway, I'm getting too used to the mic. I'll try and get off quick. So I'm here to introduce Alexei for his 2-year confirmation seminar, and we have a panel session afterwards. Alexei will be speaking to his PhD, his doctoral study, which is a study of adaptation and notions of resilience in 2 Pacific small island developing states. I think that's the right terminology, and 2 interesting cities in those states. And he's undertaken very extensive field work, and I really congratulate him on doing that, because I know it's been a lot of hard work and probably a bit of pressure on the household at home during those absences. So he's in a great position to tell his story today, which is where he's got to, his PhD journey, 2 years in now, and where he's taking it. So I'll just acknowledge also the cheer squad, or the squawk squad up the back, Holly and Leo. So welcome, great to see you both. And so without further ado, I'll pass to Alexei. He'll take us through for about 40 minutes, then we'll have about 10 minutes for discussion, something like that. All right, Alexei, thanks.
I'm hoping that's working. Great. I'll leave that one there. Great. Thank you everyone for coming along. As I mentioned before, it's sort of middle of winter and the university's pretty quiet at this time. So I really appreciate you coming along to hear a little bit about the research that I've been doing in the Pacific. Before I begin, I just wanted to start with an acknowledgement of country, particularly important given that it's NAIDOC week at the moment. And that goes out to this being on the land of the Wurundjeri people within the Kulin Nation, but also I want to extend that sort of acknowledgement beyond to Indigenous peoples more globally, because I think this is something that's really critical in the research that I do, but also is one of the reasons that I'm so interested in looking at the Pacific. There are just a few things sort of visually that I wanted to throw out there before I really kick off. Obviously, cities are a really complicated space in terms of colonial dispossession and the role that Western powers have played in terms of taking over countries like Australia, and the interface between Indigenous culture, knowledge, and place, but also resources and areas within those cities that are traditionally very important. Is a really complicated issue to grapple with. And that is obviously very evident in Australia, but equally plays out in the Pacific. And there's a really complicated interface between the two. So you can see in the bottom left, there's Indigenous traditional owners protesting against the Adani mine, which obviously has very major coal implications. And that extends to some of our Pacific Island colleagues who've come across and blockaded Newcastle, one of the world's largest coal ports in Australia, a number of years back. So just a couple of things to think about before we get started. Okay, so this is just a bit of an overview of the research project. This is maybe a bit of a different area for a lot of you in terms of that there are not a huge number of people that work directly in the Pacific, and even fewer that work in cities in the Pacific, and then only a handful that work in terms of climate change within cities in the Pacific. So just to give you a little bit of an overview of the research that I'm doing beyond the introduction that Brendan gave me, what I'm really trying to look at is how the informal settlements within those cities are engaging with a lot of the climate resilient development projects that are working in the Pacific currently. And how that interface is working in a couple of case study cities that I'm looking at. So this is part of an ongoing PhD research project. These findings are only preliminary, and I'd really love your feedback at the end, just to sort of push on a few more ideas and allow me to dig a little bit deeper into the analysis that I've been doing. So this is in particular looking at 2 cities, Port Vila in Vanuatu and Honiara in the Solomon Islands. And as Brendan mentioned, it's largely hinged on a number of semi-structured interviews that have engaged with 6 communities across, well, 3 communities in each of those 2 cities, as well as institutional representatives, and to try and look at how those 2 intersect. And I'll go into a little bit of detail about how I've approached that and a sort of a wider conceptual framework that I've developed for tackling that. I'd really like to acknowledge, in particular, the Melbourne School of Design and the Australian German Climate and Energy College, as well as Missy, for supporting a lot of my fieldwork directly through funding support, but also in country in both Vanuatu and the Solomon Islands. A number of organisations have been really critical to the work that I've done. That includes the National Cultural Council in Vanuatu and the National Advisory Board on Climate Change and Disaster Risk Reduction. And in the Solomon Islands, the Ministry of Education, Research and Training, and the Ministry of Lands, Housing and Survey. On top of that, I really want to thank the research assistants. Doesn't really do justice to the work that they've done with me, but in both countries, Bresley Arnatau and Anne Pakoa in Vanuatu, who were my two guides through the communities that I went through there, and Lorraine Livia in the Solomon Islands. And of course, this research wouldn't have been possible without the extensive contributions from the communities and institutional representatives that provided me with their time so that I could conduct this research. Okay, so this is just sort of a rough overview of how I want to sort of go through the seminar today, and it's a little bit backloaded in terms of the research findings because, as I mentioned, this is quite an unusual area for a lot of people. So to start off with, I wanted to sort of go through the rationale for looking at Pacific cities. The Pacific's not really understood as an urban place in general, but there's a really interesting interface there at the sort of what I call the fringe of the urban age that I just sort of want to get my teeth into a little bit before we get any further. But in particular, I want to provide a little bit of a rationale for why small island developing states are so important when it comes to global frameworks for development. And the two countries that I'm looking at are both small island developing states and least developed countries. So some of the poorest and some of the most marginalized countries, but also some that have some very unique characteristics that need to be grappled with. I also want to dig a little bit deeper into what climate vulnerability means and maybe be a little bit critical about exactly what that term is used for. Both by people who are deemed to be vulnerable and by those who are identifying those spaces as being vulnerable. Secondly, I want to go into climate resilient development and do a little bit of a dive into the theory of resilience. That might be a little bit heavy for a Tuesday morning, but bear with me, it's brief and relatively painless. And from there, I'll go into the actual, the findings from the research itself. Okay, so first of all, why look at Pacific cities? And this is a picture at in the center of Honiara at the river mouth of the Matanico River, which was experienced a major flood event in 2014. As you can see, there's a really complicated interface already just looking at this image here, and I hope maybe some of the slides after this don't need justification just once you've sort of dug into this. So there are people swimming in the river because there is a lack of washing facilities and water access in the informal settlements at the river mouth. As you can obviously see, there's a huge amount of plastics pollution. And as you can imagine from the built infrastructure on these riverbanks, there's a really complicated both tidal and riverine interface in terms of potential risks and hazards that these communities face. But also, as you can probably guess by the boats, there's a really a positive side to that as well in terms of the way that the river is used by the community. And you can actually see a kid really enjoying the surf occurring at the interface of the tide coming up the river, interestingly. The river extends up into the hills on the left. So why cities? Well, obviously, as I'm sure you're all very aware, that we are now in a predominantly urban world as of a few years ago. And this trend is set to continue accelerating. I don't want to go into that in too much detail other than to say that if you sort of break down the projected figures towards 2050, the current projections are looking at an extra 2.5 billion people living within urban areas by that point in time, the middle of this century. What that effectively means is we need to double the extent of cities that we have globally over that period of time. So cities are both a major issue, but also a major opportunity for changing how we approach dealing with everything from climate change to also where these cities are located and how that growth occurs in terms of risk areas and the potential for alleviating poverty through that process. Within that overarching body of cities, though, of course, is a large amount of city components that are currently uncontrolled. And to sort of clarify what is meant by informality, what I'm looking at in this study is informal settlements themselves, not the overall economy and the other structures that extend beyond those spaces, but just to look at that one particular aspect, which by UN Habitat are defined as spaces that have a lack of improved drinking water, or a lack of safe sanitation, a lack of durable housing, a lack of adequate living spaces, so that's in terms of the relative space for the number of people living in a household, and or a lack of secure tenure. So it's one or more of those categories. And it's interesting to sort of think about this just in the Pacific, because just at the rear of this building, this is Little Grattan Street, which is quite literally behind this building. In the 1930s, was one of Melbourne's most notorious slum spaces. So this is something that actually we as Australians have grappled with. And it's really interesting to sort of, you can still see those buildings in the background if you walk back along Bouverie Street. And that photo was by a chap called Oswald Barnett, who was actually an advocate for social housing policies that came through in Australia. So this is something that has been grappled with for a long period of time, but is also a really interesting component of Australian society in the recent past. So presently around 880 million people are living or meet one of the first 4 criteria. The reason I say 4 out of those 5 is because land tenure is extremely complicated to define. So it's something that's very hard to measure. And exactly what is defined as having secure land tenure is something that's very contentious and contested between the nation states that sort of set up the framework for UN Habitat itself. So urban informality as a percentage of the total amount of people living in cities has actually fallen since 1990, but the total amount is still rising. So you can see this in the developing regions total at the bottom here. In 1990, roughly 46.2% of the urban population were living within informal areas, and that's fallen to 29.7% in 2014. But the total number has continued to increase. So where does that place the Pacific? Well, the Pacific small island developing states are expected to gain another 3.9 million urban inhabitants by 2050. Now, in the total scheme of global population, that's relatively small. But when you take into account the actual geographies and spaces available within Pacific countries, that's actually a massive figure that's really difficult to grapple with in terms of their limited spatial resources, but also alternative economies and access to this global economy that is drawing people into city spaces. So that's a rate of increase 3.5 times the projected global average. So just for those of you who are less familiar with the sort of the geospatial aspects of exactly what small island developing states are. So this is sort of a group within the United Nations that is characterized by a number of things. One of them is coastal vulnerability and obviously in the name, largely small islands. You'll see some of these countries are actually land-based countries. They're not all entirely in the sort of the island classifications that you'd imagine. But they also include a number of non-UN member states. So you'll see the Northern Mariana Islands and Guam are included in that list, as well as American Samoa and others in the Caribbean. Largely, they're grouped into these 3 major groupings, the Pacific being probably the largest spatially. And I really like this map because what it actually shows is it reinterprets exactly how much space these islands take up. So these the coloured areas are the exclusive economic zones of countries within the ocean, which obviously is the majority of the Earth's surface. So often we'll see a map that just outlines what is in white and doesn't really take into account actually when you look at the amount of space that is controlled by these countries, it's actually quite large. It just might not be habitable land space. And often you'll hear in the Pacific it's referred to as islands linked by ocean as opposed to small islands within large oceans. And I mean, one interesting question I had earlier on was, well, okay, so your PhD is paid for by the Australian government. So what would you say to an Australian taxpayer as to why your research is significant? Which I hadn't really thought about very much, but just to give you an Australian government perspective, 31% of Australia's overseas development assistance budget is actually committed to the Pacific region. And this has some obvious rationales in terms of it is the region immediately adjacent to Australia and some historical ones as well. But I'm sure a lot of you will have heard in the press recently the interactions with China and the geopolitical sort of ramifications of what the Pacific region is between Australia, the US, New Zealand, and other more classical Western powers. What's very interesting within that, though, is you might not necessarily think of the Australian government as doing a lot in terms of climate change and climate change funding. But within that budget, 8.7% is committed to building resilience, and that's in a much broader sense than just climate change, of course, but that's still not insignificant. And there are also a number of regional and other initiatives that are worth noting. So at the 2016 Pacific Islands Forum, there was a commitment by Malcolm Turnbull to fund $300 million of adaptation and resilience funding over a 4-year period. Now, how much of this is new funding is extremely questionable, I would argue, but that's probably a conversation for another seminar. But at the same time, it is notable that there is climate change adaptation thinking being mainstreamed into all kinds of different projects. And that quite literally goes from major infrastructure builds through to basket weaving programs and small economies that exist across the Pacific Islands. So similarly, there's a major contribution that Australia makes to the currently problematic Green Climate Fund. And that, of course, is something that is not to be sort of sneered at either. And there are a number of partner projects with other entities such as the World Bank, the United Nations Development Program, I'm going to get stuck in acronym soup here, the Secretariat for the Pacific Community, and the South Pacific Regional Environmental Program. That's my bingo done for the day. So, I mean, this is the other way to look at it, which of course is to be a little bit more global in terms of the perspective that we take into looking at some of these spaces. So this is an interpretation of disaster risk that was done by the United Nations Environment and Human Security Institute over in Bonn. And you can sort of see here that if you start taking into account a number of the different factors that are being considered in disaster risk, there's a really strong parallel, not just with the tropics, but also with the small island developing states. And if I can use this properly, no, I can't. Oh no, that's gone haywire. There we go. So you can see there's Vanuatu here, the Solomon Islands is there. And if you look at the top 15 countries with the highest risk worldwide, Vanuatu comes in at number 1, Solomon Islands at number 6. So this is sort of some global analysis at a very coarse scale that's averaging out a number of assessments that have been done from 2012 to 2016. But it just really highlights exactly why these small island developing states are really characterized as being climate vulnerable. So what happens within cities? And this is going to why I really want to look at informality in particular. So this is UN Habitat's approach for planning for climate change and the way that they conduct vulnerability assessments. And I won't go into it in too much detail, but what it does take into account is exposure to climate hazards. So that's if you inhabiting, for instance, a high risk flood zone, the sensitivity of whether it's settlements or infrastructure to a particular climate risk. So that, for instance, is if a cyclone comes through an area, one house might be destroyed, but another one might be fine. One of those houses has much weaker physical infrastructure. Similarly, during a heat wave, elderly and young and sickly people are more likely to die of heat risk. And that's because they have high levels of sensitivity. So taking exposure sensitivity and a slightly more complicated idea of adaptive capacity. So this might be access to something like health services, but it could also be a general knowledge about disaster preparedness or having a bushfire plan in place, something like that. If you take those three things into account, you can actually start to look at hotspots within a city. And this was done in Honiara back in 2016, taking into account a number of different variables. And this is a sort of a map of Honiara from east to west. The darker red areas are areas which have a higher level of sensitivity. The black areas are areas with a high level of exposure to disaster, to climate hazards. And these sort of hashed areas are the informal settlements across the city, which have actually been relatively well mapped out. What you can really see clearly there spatially is a correlation between the informal settlements and areas of high climate vulnerability. That is also reinforced because these spaces have a lack of adaptive capacity in the sense that they don't have easy access to government institutions that are able to support them during a disaster response. And this was observed very strongly recently in Port Vila and Vanuatu during Tropical Cyclone Pam, where a lot of informal settlements were severely neglected in terms of coping with disaster, with that particular disaster. So where does informal climate resilience fit within this? And this is a really interesting question. So this is an interesting quote from, I guess, a critique of some of the thinking around resilience. And urban resilience is far from merely being the flip side of vulnerability, and I think that's really important to emphasize. It's some interpretations have placed it as this, but there are some, and I won't go into it now, but there are some really strong arguments as to why that's not an effective way to look at them as sort of being the opposite sides of a coin. It does, however, link up to a lot of the characteristics within this idea of adaptive capacity. So this is an assessment done in Port Vila, and as you can see, there's a very limited amount of financial access. This is a stakeholder-based assessment that was conducted through that same UN Habitat project. And there's a lack of finance, a lack of resourcing, and high levels of hazard exposure for critical infrastructure. But what you really start to see is community leadership coming out strongly. A lot of these attributes are things that actually are strongly aligned with resilience thinking in terms of the ability of these communities to have redundancies within a system that they can lean on, the ability to draw on things like disaster knowledge, stakeholder hazard awareness, which is another key strength. But you can start to see how they aren't necessarily just flip sides of vulnerability, because a lot of these ideas of resilience are feeding in through this concept of adaptive capacity. Okay, so this is maybe to go into a little bit of a quick history of this part of the Pacific and why it's so complicated to just look at sort of international urban growth figures. And the key quote down the bottom is here. Despite Port Vila having an official average annual growth rate of 4.8% per annum, that only takes into account this small area here. And this is a remnant of the complex interface with colonial powers in the Pacific, where municipal areas were effectively alienated from customary landowner systems and therefore were fixed over time. So in the sense that City of Melbourne is only this small area of the centre of Melbourne here, there's a much wider expansion that is going on beyond that space that actually means that the metropolitan area of Vanuatu as a whole is actually 28.7% of the total population of Vanuatu, which is not how you see that figure represented in terms of international urbanisation rates. So I just really wanted to emphasise that there's a really complicated reason as to why urbanisation in the Pacific, and that was even based on those figures I showed you before, is currently being severely underestimated. There's another interesting side to this as well, which comes out of this quote here from Rawlings, which is, "It is rare for the term man villa," which is a person from Port Vila, excuse the gendered particular of that phrase, to be used by either rural to urban migrants in town or by peri-urban villages, except perhaps by way of insult. And this is a really interesting aspect of what it means to be within a city. The people who migrate into urban space in the Pacific are in a lot of ways cut off from what is identified as being national and customary culture and links and traditions. So it's a lot harder to identify exactly what urban means in these spaces. So just to quickly go through that, current global urban dwellings, dwelling capacity needs to effectively be doubled by 2050, and there's a huge opportunity here to do urban right. But at the moment, there are a lot of problems, and it's actually not being managed effectively. There's a large number of urban informal habitants globally, and this is continuing to increase. The small island developing states themselves represent some of the most climate vulnerable countries in very complicated post or maybe arguably neo-colonial urban environments, but a number of UN agreements, particularly climate agreements, have really focused on this space. So I think there's probably a pretty strong argument there that efforts to build climate resilience in urban systems lack effective mechanisms for engaging with the informal systems that are prevalent in the rapid growth cities of least developed climate exposed countries, which is the problem statement that's shaped my thesis overall. So resilience thinking, and this is where you go a little bit deep in, so I'm sorry if you haven't had your morning coffee, but I just want to sort of go into what resilience is, because it's something that's really important. And one of the key findings from this research is that the way that it's just used as a buzzword actually really detracts from the capacities in a lot of this theory to be applied properly within cities practically. So Hollings largely attributed as being sort of the father of this wave of resilience thinking, I suppose, and in 1973 came up with the idea that in ecological systems there was another property beyond that actually enabled systems to persist under highly unstable conditions. So this is in contrast to theories of stable equilibrium. And in this original sort of idealization of what resilience is, Holling proposed that resilience determines the persistence of relationships within a system and is a measure of the ability of these systems to absorb changes of state variables, driving variables and parameters and still persist. So a very basic, compared to the sort of contemporary framings of what resilience is, understanding of that, but that's sort of where it's attributed to have begun. This then expanded across a number of other disciplines though, and this is where it really starts to get messy. So it was taken up in great numbers in psychology, but also in engineering, and obviously continued in ecology. And this led to some strong divergences in exactly how this was being applied. In particular, this related to what the capacity for system change was during and after a shock. So as you can imagine, an engineered system was expected to return back to its exact previous state, an idea known as bounce back. In an ecological sense, though, there was a recognition that systems can actually change out of different basins of equilibrium. So for maybe a grassland to turn into a forested area and vice versa. So there were some really complicated sort of theoretical discussions about exactly where that sat. I'm not going to go into psychology. It's interesting that this is so often overlooked in this discussion, and I'm going to do just that, which is extremely hypocritical. But one really important thing is that obviously a psychological understanding of resilience is very different, because a complete collapse in a psychological system is not an option. So it's something that I'm just going to put to the side. Welcome to ask me questions about it afterwards. A sort of second phase, though, of the evolution of resilience thinking really centers around the systems and the shocks and stresses that it's focused on. So this is where the application moved from out of disciplines into very practical areas such as disaster management, climate change, urban planning, communication, security, terrorism. That list just goes on. And this was really interesting, because what this started to see was a mapping out of principles and characteristics that tried to incorporate the subject system diversity and different ideas of what a system is. So while systems thinking in and of itself presents a very sort of coherent, simplistic idea of how you can apply anything within a system as long as it's able to be bounded in a certain way. When you're applying it through something like climate change, which is implying actually that there's a continual and dynamic change to the shocks and stresses of a system, as opposed to disaster management, where you can deal with the disaster on a singular basis, but have a dynamic approach before and after that event, has really different implications. And then this started to move into the field of social sciences. And this is where this really gets messy, because there's a huge amount of arguments against the use of resilience in socially centered systems at all. This is due to the nature of these systems as actually being not just dynamic and constantly evolving and not ever in a real system state of stability, but also because there are other factors in play there in terms of the agency of the individuals within that system, equity and rights, the manipulation of the system, and the dynamics of power that are not really well dealt with when you're looking at something that is relatively less able to take those ideas on board from within a system, like an ecological landscape, a savanna, or a built system that doesn't have those same levels of manipulation of these ideas of what resilience is. So that's almost as deep as I'm going to go. But this is just to show you, this is some analysis that I've done of peer-reviewed use of the idea of urban climate resilience specifically. So by urban climate resilience, we're talking about the ability of a system to maintain function or maintain, adapt, or improve its functions under the experience of a climate-related shock or stress. So you can see there that's already taken on a number of different aspects of that previous slide. One of them is defining the shocks and stresses that we're looking at into just being climate-related ones. And that's something that's very interesting, and I'm going to come back to that right at the end. But this is obviously very specific to climate-related shocks and stresses. So we're already ruling out things like tsunamis, an interesting interface with disaster management, for instance. The systems themselves are being defined as urban, but of course the bounds of an urban system are extremely contested in another set of literature that I'm also not going into. But they're two of the key things to think about. But what I really want you to look at is actually just have a look at this evolution. So this is from 1990 forwards. As you can see, there's a huge amount of literature on community resilience, and this is something that incorporates urban spaces in its own right. And ecological resilience, psychological resilience come through quite strongly. Interestingly, engineering resilience is usually just referred to as resilience. I don't know if that's a lack of self-awareness or if there's some other sort of thing going on there, but it's usually just called resilience, so I can't really plot that effectively on this graph. And you see disaster resilience there as well. What you can actually see, though, are a few sort of interesting sort of lines here. There's the first sort of set of resilience that focuses in first wave, I guess, and there's sort of a second wave that comes through here where there's climate, economic, and urban resilience, which is one of the larger groups of sort of contemporary literature and emergent groups of literature on resilience. And then you can actually see that climate resilient development and urban climate resilience as specific terms are very nascent and very small. And although they're increasing rapidly in practice, their existence in peer-reviewed literature databases is quite limited. That said, in terms of the way that it's being used within policy and practice, as Mira and Stultz observe here, resilience now rivals sustainability as a major organising principle or buzzword for urban research and policy. The challenge is that resilience, like sustainability, is a fuzzy concept that is not easily defined or measured. So I'm going to come back to that at the end as well. So this is the most technical slide of the whole thing. So just bear with me, and then you'll be out the other end after this one. So I just want to go briefly into the idea of Panarchy, which is, I think, as Brendan's pointed out before, inspires the idea of panic at the same time as everything else. It's not exactly the nicest term, but it is nonetheless heavily cited. I think the original book, Panarchy, by Gunderson and Holling, has been cited over 2,400 times. The first peer-reviewed journal that used the term Panarchy has been cited over 1,400 times. So it's a very commonly used concept in terms of resilience thinking, but that's its own sort of relatively small field. So this idea is centered on two things. The first one is this sort of Mobius strip concept, which is a way of trying to encapsulate the dynamic nature of resilience into four key sort of dynamic spaces. These are conservation, release, reorganization, and exploitation. So you can sort of imagine how these center around a major shock or stress event, that a system is able to go through different phases of effectively reorganization, of generation of growth, of collapse, of creative reconstruction. So that reorganization phase, it's interesting to note, is the stage that is least examined and the least known, according to Holling in 2001. It is the beginning of a process of reorganization that provides the potential for subsequent growth, resource accumulation, and storage. It is a time of both crisis and opportunity. But the thing about Panarchy is it's really about this idea of nested adaptive scales. So what is critical here is that you're understanding that these systems, or these Mobius strips, operate within and outside of other Mobius strips, I suppose, that are able to interact at different scales of time and at different speeds that have implications for the other layers. So it's a different way of looking at sort of hierarchy theory in a way that takes into account that dynamic change. It's widely theorized, but as you can probably imagine from my brief and rather poor description just now, it's not very well used in practice, and that's something that's really critical to think about. So to sort of reiterate that, while resilience theory is often praised for its focus on the interconnections between social and ecological systems, a common critique leveled against resilience theory generally, and urban climate resilience more specifically, is that it fails to address issues of equity. So I've just sort of generated this diagram to give this as a demonstration with informal settlements in mind. So if you have informal settlements as one component within a city system, and then they operate very specifically through their own networks that operate right down to a household scale, a real question comes to mind is if you're trying to maintain core function as a way of maintaining the identity of a system, does the city planner take these systems into account? And anyone who's worked with informal settlements would immediately say, no, that's not really integrated into the way of city scale thinking as it's conducted in most cases. So there's a tension between resilience as a property and something that is actively enacted and aimed for by actors. And if there are actors at a city scale that are actively aiming to generate some level of city resilience, and there's I guess a rogue component of the system that isn't well integrated into that, a really functional approach to the city would be to look at that and say, well, okay, well, if we just remove this part, if we clear this informal settlement, or if we fully formalize it in a way that's very rigid and structured, then we'll have a better operating city scale, without taking into account the real richness of networks that operate at a sub-city system level. So this is my sort of conceptual framework for approaching this issue, and I'm going to walk you through it gently, I hope. And it takes into account, or this diagram takes into account, two of those key things. One of them are those nested adaptive cycles, and you can sort of see this here. So what I've done is I've looked at urban climate resilience, discourse theory and characteristics, and that's within academia and intergovernmental and regional organisations. Then I've looked at climate resilience focused development assistance programs, such as overseas development assistance, the development bank programs, and international NGOs. I've also then gone through state-based policies, initiatives and structures, a sort of a subscale and at a national level, national government agencies and the like. And then at the sort of whole of city scale, you've got urban governance and planning with municipal and provincial government. What the focus of my research, though, is how these sets of nested adaptive cycles interface with the community level, which is where a lot of that informal capacity is generated and stored. And civil societies, interestingly, I originally had them in this sort of system, but they sort of operate to the side of it in a practical way. And the key thing in cities in the Pacific, but a lot of cities, is that actually the issue is it's a cross-boundary one, is that you've got an urban domain, but you've got a huge number of migrant households coming into that system. And they operate largely in the Pacific in a non-urban way, that they're bringing a huge number of resources and different ways of thinking about cities into the city. So these are the two axes that I've sort of demonstrated there, and you can imagine there's a third dimensional one, which is the dynamics of shocks and stresses. So in each of the two case study cities, I've gone through each of these hierarchies in reference to one major shock event, which was Tropical Cyclone Pam in Port Vila in Vanuatu, and the 2014 floods in Honiara in the Solomon Islands. What's really interesting is that interface has been sort of structured outside of this body of literature elsewhere. And this is Helmkin-Levitsky's sort of typology, I suppose, of understanding the interface between formal and informal institutions within cities. So you can sort of categorize them in four different ways. You can have informal structures that are complementing a city structure. So this is where they address formal institutional gaps without actually, within the formal institutional framework. And this is where the functional alignment, I suppose, is the same between informal institutions and formal institutions. So they're both trying to get to the same end game. But if you've got an ineffective formal institutional environment, you find they're substitutive. So they're actually replacing some of the formal services in a unique way that actually operates that operates in a way that is intended by the formal institutions themselves. Where those functional alignments are divergent, though, is where a lot of this stuff gets really messy. So in the bottom left, you've got the idea that you can be accommodating, so they can break the formal structural rules, but they're not directly undermining them, but they are actually, in a lot of ways, contradicting those intended functions, or you can actually have informal systems that are competing. So you can imagine some of those classic ideas of competing informal structures would be in say in favelas where there are gangs that are actively undermining government capacities or attacking police or something like that. I'm going to come back to that at the end, because what I'm going to do is show you some examples across each of those 4 categories within each of the 2 case studies themselves. Okay, so now I'm going to take you right down to the ground in the 2 cities themselves in the last 10 minutes or so. And what I want to do is just bring out some of those examples across those 4 areas. But first of all, just to quickly run you over exactly what I've done through this research. So these are maps of the 2 cities with the 3, I've gone very fuzzy, that's an interesting pixelated thing, with the 3 communities in each of the cities that I've looked at. So just to go over them briefly, in the inner city of Honiara, there's Ontong Java settlement. So you remember that picture with the plastic and the little boat before. That's the river mouth of the Matanico, which is just there. There's a sort of, I guess you could call an urban fringe suburban informal community in Wind Valley on the western boundary of the city here. And there's Jabros community, which is across the municipal boundary in the customary land tenure areas that exist beyond that space. In Port Vila, again, sort of 3 similar areas, I suppose. Seaside, which is a very dense inner city area that probably more aligns with the classic understanding of what a slum would look like in terms of its physical layout and very ad hoc use of infrastructure. Black Sands community, which is one of the oldest, most established informal communities across the city, but does actually lie outside of the municipal land, interestingly in a bit of a grey zone with customary land ownership systems, but owned by one of the main customary landowner groups in the city. And, and ETAS, which is a large, there's about 6,000 people out in this community out near the landfill site, using that space largely because it's got access through the road to the landfill itself, but with a complete paucity of services. So in terms of the research that was conducted, I did interviews with 77 community members and 27 institutional stakeholder representatives, and then conducted 7 community follow-up workshops and a number of supplementary meetings. And this was paired with that analysis of those sort of hierarchy policy documents and also some of the spatial secondary data and socioeconomic data that I was able to access. Okay, so just one quick example of complementary resilience, climate resilience. So one of the key themes that came out across all of the case studies was this hybridization of traditional knowledge systems with urban spaces. And as I mentioned, when you're bringing a lot of these traditional ways of knowledge into the city and maintaining those links to traditional custom and culture, and I haven't really explained, but both of these countries have over 100 living languages in extremely small populations. So you've got an extremely diverse set of traditional cultures to draw on. I mean, in a resilient sense, that's a huge amount of diversity that actually generates a massive amount of potential knowledge that's used within these communities. So here on the left, you can see I actually went through as a Category 5 cyclone hit Vanuatu in the middle of winter, which is completely unheard of. And I won't go into exactly any of that at the moment, but as you can see here, there's cassava crops here that have been stripped right down the trunks of those trees. So this is sort of an urban farm, I suppose you could call it. And what the gentleman who owns that plot of land has done is strip them down using a traditional approach that means that when the strong winds come through, they don't completely break all of those cassava crops and are able to rebound. Even though the leaves have been taken off, they quickly regrow rather than being flattened. In another example over here, you can see on the right-hand side, there's an A-frame which survived through Tropical Cyclone Pam. The building on the left was flattened and has been rebuilt. But there's an interesting juxtaposition there of a traditional roofing technique where the household here was able to strap pieces of bamboo across the top in a way that they would have used back in the islands. But with very limited resource access in the city, that was apparently quite an unusual approach to take because they don't have the same access to ecosystem services that they would elsewhere. And this is probably my favorite sort of illustration of that hybrid use of traditional knowledge in an urban space. This is one of the community members from ETAS, and this is saying before the cyclone came last time, a lot of people from Banks, which is one of the island groups, they were hiding in caves when the cyclone hit. So we started looking for caves here as well. I felt like the cave was much safer and we didn't hear any effects of wind. It was quiet inside. We got solar, we watched laptops, movies during Big Cyclone Pam. So they're actually talking about a completely different environment and a different disaster response setting to what were actually really horrendous and very problematic adaptations of schools elsewhere in the city. So it's not always a bad thing. And I just really wanted to bring that out as to some of the real strengths of looking at some of these spaces in different ways and how could a city potentially incorporate that into the way that it plans for climate-related disaster response. So substitutive climate resilience. And so this is thinking about it in terms of where the informal structures are effectively substituting the formal structures in a direct way. One of the key structures that exists across all of these communities, and one of the main themes in all of the interviews, was around the role of churches. And there's not just a church, there are a number of different church groups, and there are a really interesting interface between church groups, government, and also aid programs that are fairly reticent to engage through religious organizations. So here are two examples of two very different church settings. On the left, you have the Anglican Church of Melanesia actually actively using the church to generate what is the city's only evacuation system in Honiara. And this is the best built structure in Ongtong Java settlement. And there you've got sirens, alarms, and instruction sheets that explain how to evacuate up to the hills. This is the only example of this that I know of that has been run by the National Disaster Management Office, although they are planning on expanding it, but largely at the community's own initiative. That's a very well-resourced church organisation structure that exists and has been supported and been able to reconnect. And in actual fact, while I was there, they were fundraising for a Tongan disaster response at the time. So you can see how these connections and networks actually operate across Pacific Islands, not just within the Pacific Islands themselves. On the right-hand side, and this is really interesting, is what's called a local church. So this is a church run by Willie Roma, who's the local chief who's been in this informal settlement since it began. He was probably the first settlement, and he has a customary arrangement with the Ifira landowner group to actually supply them with things like pigs and food and garden products as his way of paying rent for this space. But because it's an informal settlement and he's not connected to any other church groups, he's unable to access the resources that these particular networks have, even though this church has a congregation of about 200 people that are independent of these sort of semi-institutionalized structures on the left. And he's neither able to be permitted to build a permanent structure because he doesn't have the political leverage over the customary landowner group, but he also doesn't have the resources to build back any of the roofing or anything like that as well. So you can see there's just tarpaulins which were donated by a gentleman who walked through there at some point, according to Chief Willie Roma. So just to sort of bring that out in a quote from Jabros community in the Solomon Islands, especially from here, you go down and it's a community. From here valley inside, the community has different churches. The church for one community, they control how these people live. The church pastors, when problems occur, you mentioned church, they go, oh yes, let's meet after prayer, and they basically generate these entire community structures around how this church works. So the bell rings, and the bells are these amazing sort of reused gas canisters. And we respect every people, the community, children, women, elderly, people in the community too. So this is a really critical sort of component that's substituting what is effectively should be urban governance structures, but from an international climate resilient development perspective really needs to be engaged. Accommodating climate resilience. So this is where it starts to get a little bit messy, and I want to talk a bit about land tenure itself. So when we sort of understand land tenure in an urban planning process, you'd imagine an allotment area that is confined to one household that lives in one space that is very strictly sort of where that house lives, and there's not really, but the way that it's idealized is as a nuclear household, sort of, you know, mum, dad, 2 kids, and there's a whole bunch of problems with how that's constructed in Australia, but it's even more problematic in the Pacific. So this is an example of an allotment in sort of a semi-formalized community in the Solomon Islands. So the area that exists is within those dotted lines there. You've got family unit 1 there. That's the chief of the community. Then you've got his sister and her family in this household. You've got his father over here living in a separate space. And then I think you've got some of his cousins over here in a different space there. Then within that space, you've also got the community water tank that operates for around 50 households. You've got an outhouse and a shared sort of kitchen space, and then a community meeting space. This is all within one allotment. So it's a very different way of understanding resourcing. And actually, from a resilience perspective, you've got these sub-networks that are being completely underused by all of the development programs. This was funded by World Vision Solomon Islands in combination with DFAT, actually, this water tank, but it's a discontinued program. Unfortunately, because it was extremely successful. And this is a community that was traditionally relying on ecosystem services, the upstream river that's now been built up through the encroachment of housing up into the foothills behind that space, so is no longer able to be used safely for drinking water and washing water. And the other part of this is, of course, gardens. So when we think of cities, although we might idealize the idea of reintegrating community growing and rooftop farms and things like that, in actual fact, this is already happening in the Pacific and always has been. And there's often a garden that's sort of a sub garden adjacent to the house, and then there'll be a bush garden up in the hills. And the tenure arrangements for gardens are completely different to housing in terms of customary law. So the way that they're reappropriated within government land, like here you can see a whole bunch of taro that's been planted around this water source, is reflective of that. So the landowners just provide us their land to plant food while they use the land for their project. Plant anything they want. Only families who came here first and buy big land, acres of land, so they just ask us to go out and plant food. So effectively letting anyone use this space for a whole bunch of other reasons in terms of family linkages and things like that. So that's where we are now. Like we said, it's God's blessing. He can help us. Even though the land where we are staying is not enough, we can get food from the other land. But where it's really problematic is where those uses compete. And I'm going to try and sort of wrap up after this, but I just really want to go into this in some detail. So this on the left is what used to be the river that was used by the Jabros community in the foothills of Honiara. As you can see, it's fenced off with barbed wire fence, no less, by the local water utility. So what's happened is the city's expanded is that what was previously seen as a free, or in the rural setting, a shared water resource has now been monetized and removed from that system. So you might have seen on an earlier slide, there was colonization and capitalization. And I don't mean that in the sense of using all caps. I mean that in the financial sense that there is actually a monetization of assets that is still going on in these spaces. But that's really problematic for people that operate within these informal hybrid spaces. So as you can see from the quote from the community chief here, first, when we settled here, we have a stream here, and then Solomon Water come and pipe it. When we arrived here, we used to use our stream, then they take it from us. And so there's this interesting interface here between sort of what are assumed to be ecosystem services and how that's sort of reinterpreted. And then on the right-hand side, you've got ETAS community, and this is where it really goes wrong. So there was a large project that came in, and because the land tenure arrangements weren't properly understood, going back to the previous slide, to use the words of this particular respondent, first time somebody helped us with the water pipe. Like he put a pipe to each home, and then some they used it and some they didn't pay. And then because this land, and the bit that sort of trails off here is to do with the arrangements of tenure, people got angry and they started cutting up the pipe. So no development agency will now go into that space. But it was really because the first one hadn't properly understood the informal systems that existed in that area. So now you have 6,000 people who have to walk roughly 2.5 hours to a water source that's downstream of the unsealed landfill for the whole of Port Vila. So you can sort of imagine how that plays out. All right, so I'm probably going to just end on this one, but just to sort of follow up maybe with this quote. So this is from Wind Valley community, which is one of the best organised communities across the city, and I think it's maybe a useful point to start a quick discussion. So this respondent said, I think I find that the community here are a little bit well set up, not like some of the other communities around Honiara, and this is an informal settlement mind. So they've got chiefs, church leaders, and all these other things. The community, people from the provinces, they live here. Everyone has their own chiefs, so that's all the different provinces have their own different chiefs. Everyone works together. I know that some projects come up to help the community. Sometimes the community might not be talked to. Projects that come up need to talk to the committee. Without them, the projects fail. Then sometimes also projects from outside come, they fail, people get a little bit tired of them, so they don't work. And that's effectively saying there's a community fatigue, because this repeat consultation that's not understanding these structures is repeating the same problems, and it generates a dislike in the community for the projects themselves. I'm not going to go into that, but I think that's probably a useful quote to end on. Oh, I might do one last, oh, sorry, I've gone right to the end there. Just one last quote on the sort of the meaning of resilience, and this is maybe an interesting one to end on instead. So this was from one of the institutional respondents, and I haven't had the time to go into the responses today, but that from this gentleman's perspective, he said, on the meaning of resilience, that question is very important, because whatever phrase or word we come up with, that will have a big impact. As far as people's understanding is concerned, resilience, there isn't a phrase, there isn't a pidgin equivalent, or even closest to resilience. And so this is an idea at a discursive level that literally can't even translate to a community level. So there's a huge opportunity to actually shape how this is used in these spaces and actually how it's engaged within these informal settlements themselves. All right, thank you very much.
Well done, Alexei. Thank you. Brilliantly illustrated as ever. We've probably about 5 minutes for some discussion. We're hard up against the timeline with the panel starting at 10 o'clock. So anyone have a question or reflection, generate or contribute to discussion? I might start by asking you. Sorry, my apologies. Hear me better now. But I would invite questions from you guys, but just perhaps to get it going quickly, some of that, well, what would one call it? Malfunctioning and cross-purposing and almost institutional brutality and the water utility and all that kind of stuff. Is there a conversation around that? I mean, your research is putting a frame and a spotlight on that, the problems, the dialectics of informality, but is there a broader conversation in either city going on about that with the institutionals?
So one of the interesting things, and I skimmed over it on the slide in terms of the role of cities in colonisation, but these are spaces where most international NGOs don't engage at all. And this was really evident after Cyclone Pam, where almost all of the projects that were immediately implemented went beyond the city boundary. Very little was done within the city itself. That occurs for a number of reasons, and one of them is fairly justified, which is that the absolute levels of access to services within the outer islands is extremely problematic. And there are a number of, if you look at something like health metrics, there's an obvious reason why they go out to the provinces. But if you look at relative poverty and the access to things like those ecosystem services within cities, there's a strong argument that I would put that actually the cities need a stronger focus. So I guess the short answer is that there's a very limited consideration of cities at all in these two countries in particular. In the Solomon Islands, they had a National Urban Forum in 2016. And that was the first one that they'd ever held. And the conversation was immediately about how do we get people out of the city? And that's how cities are understood, as either transient spaces or places where people should no longer come to, they should stay in the islands. There's a little bit more consideration of it in Vanuatu as a larger space with greater economic opportunities because of the established tourism industry. But as a whole, the way that informal settlements are looked at is very limited in either one. So I don't think I could really fairly say as to whether there's a sort of a structured response to taking on those areas. Yeah.
Thanks, Alexei. That was really informative, the way you went through resilience and just snapped it up in a quick summary. Very useful, thank you. My question is about that interaction between the formal institutions and I guess the consideration of the informal settlements around that as well. Is your study looking at how that, because you mentioned that, one way they deal with it is, through your nice diagram, is that they just think if we formalise these settlements or push them out of our boundaries, that sort of deals with it. How much of that is driven by, I guess, the established islander sort of formal institutions, and how much is it driven by external funding to those formal islander institutions, if you see what I mean?
So two really different dynamics, and I didn't go into the ethnic tensions in the Solomon Islands in any detail, but the idea of migration into a city being disrupted by climate change is one thing, but it literally was lived out in terms of disruption by migrants as another thing in the Solomon Islands from the late 1990s to the early 2000s. And that was where there was a huge displacement of people out of the city because of ethnic tensions between the people who own the customary land, the Gwale around the city, and the largely Malaitan migrants who come from an island to the north that dominate the institutional structures within Honiara itself. So there's I guess two factors in play there. One of them is that there's a resistance to, there's a Ministry of Peacekeeping, internal peacekeeping in the Solomon Islands that is actively engaged in trying to make sure that there is a level of balance between informal settlements and formal. What I didn't go into are the numbers in terms of informal settlements. In Honiara, at the moment, roughly 40% of the city is informal, and that's after the peacekeeping process has gone through. So there's no way those informal settlers are getting evicted en masse. It will just lead to the tensions all over again. There's an awareness in the institutions that that's not possible. So then the question is, well, how do we build up enough capacity to upgrade or interact with those settlements in an effective way? Because at the moment, by 2020, half the city will be informal, which effectively means that half the city is entirely outside of government control. So there's a pragmatic approach by government in the Solomons to just accept that, but there's still an awareness that it's growing. And I didn't go into the statistics for Honiara there either, but they are severely underestimating urban growth over the next number of years, because during the ethnic tensions, a number went back to the islands, and that's reduced the projections for urbanisation. So there's a huge problem building there that's a whole other talk. And thanks, Helen.
I'm curious about how you were perceived or received by the community members. You already obviously had to conduct a number of interviews and workshops, and curious about how they actually interacted with you, whether you had to build a lot of trust before you could actually get a response from them.
Yeah, great question. And I probably should have disclosed for a number of years before this, I worked at RMIT and we were doing projects with UN Habitat in both of those two cities. So I've been working in Port Vila since 2013 and Honiara since 2014. So I had established rapport with a number of the communities, not all of them, but that definitely helped. I think there was an interesting balance. There's an expectation of projects coming with support and implementation and funding. And I had to be very clear and upfront saying this is a PhD project and I will do what I can for you. In some cases, I rewrote a community constitution, and they have very formalized informal, this is an informal settlements community constitution. So I retyped up the constitution, gave them copies. It was sort of those pragmatic ways of saying, I'm trying to give you what I can, but I can't, build you another water tank or, but, that said, once that was conveyed, people were very willing to engage in all of those communities, bar one that had had bad experiences with research before, and that needed a little bit more wriggle room and pushing. But, yeah.
Right, let's pull up there. Thanks. We'll pull up there given time. Thanks for that discussion, brief it was, but I think there's a lot to take away and think about from Alexei's presentation. So please join me in thanking Alexei for his presentation this morning. Thanks for coming.
And just a quick pitch, there's a list of upcoming seminars here, but also on the college website. So on the 26th of July, we've got a talk on China's clean energy transition, the 15th of August, power system control and in a mad market-driven world by Kate Summers, which is fantastic, and approaches to regional climate projections by Penny Wetton, who's also with the Climate College. So please come along. Snuck it.